Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevicius. A resident of Fall River, Massachusetts, Paul Cienniwa leads an active musical life in southeastern Massachusetts and the Boston-Providence regions as an organist, harpsichordist, and conductor. He is director of music at First Church in Boston, where he plays the 3-manual Casavant organ, the single-manual Casavant, and leads the professional First Church choir for weekly broadcasts on WERS Boston. In recent years, he has been featured organ soloist at St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue, Busch Hall at Harvard, and MIT Chapel. Cited by the Huffington Post for his inner sense of creative flow, fueled by an abundance of musical imagination and desire, Paul has a flourishing career as a soloist, recording artist, and ensemble player. He was awarded the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in harpsichord from Yale University in 2003. Paul strives to bring the harpsichord to new audiences by creating a spiritual communion through focused interpretations intensified by memorized repertoire. In this conversation, Paul shares his insights from his newest book, By Heart, The Art of Memorizing Music. Let's go to the show. Paul, I'm very delighted that we are finally able to make this conversation happen after a few tries and long days of waitings and long technical delays, right? But we are making this happen, and thank you so much for doing this. And you are so generous in your work and with your time and your ideas. I hope our listeners will get inspired that they will want to try your own ideas in their practice. Thank you so much for joining the show.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, for starters, Paul, let me ask this question, which every organist in this case might have. Why do people are afraid of memorizing music most of the time?
Well, I should begin by saying when I wrote the book, my initial intention, but it has never been for organists, and I give organists a big pass because organists play on so many different instruments. I'm frankly amazed when an organist plays a recital from memory, because especially if it's something like Messiaen, because the registration and playing on a variety of different instruments, that's a whole different challenge. And I will also say, to give a pass to organists, is that organists tend to play a lot more repertoire than, say, concert pianists, because a working church organist is playing at least 2 pieces a week, preludes and postlude, and maybe some other things in a service. So there's a greater volume of music. But that is not to discount the value of memorization, I think, for any musician. But to get back to your question, which is really about fear, why is it such a terrifying thing? And I think memorization has always been a challenge. I don't think that that somehow our generation or the past 50 years things have gotten more difficult. But I think what has happened is because of recorded sound, and in particular the sterile perfection of digital recordings, has made it so that we expect people to be perfect on stage. And I'll extend that to video, because how many videos of performances actually are that performance, or they could be a recording and someone is syncing to the recording. So we have become unhappily and unnaturally obsessed with perfection. And if you listen to earlier recorded sound, there are a fair number of errors in those recordings. So I think for today's memorizer, we are confronted with this desire to be perfect. So I think that is where our current anxiety comes from. But of course, it's even on a much lesser scale. Nobody wants to make a mistake in public. And on top of it, we as musicians spend so much time in our own passion, in our own work, to make things the way we want them. And as you know, in performance, it's never the way we want it to be. But somehow when something's memorized, that tension of wanting it to go right is even greater. So I think there's a good justification for anxiety and fear about performing from memory.
Well, Paul, I can completely, agree with you, because I get letters and messages from people asking how to memorize. What can I do to reduce my performance anxiety? When I'm playing in front of a congregation, let's say, or even an audience of different kind, and we all have different method techniques and strategies how to practice and memorize, which we will later talk, of course, in this conversation. But for the beginning organist, I will say usually that people try to memorize a piece of music, usually as a foreign language, like a poem in Japanese. They could understand, for example, how to say the words in Japanese, how to even read the words. But if they can't understand Japanese language, if they can't comprehend what they are saying, it's much more difficult then to memorize and to perform it from memory. Would you agree that if we can apply this into music, and how this relates to your practice?
I like what you said so much, I might have to steal it for the next edition of the book.
Please do.
I don't know if there will be a next edition. But right, the fact is that a lot of people memorize out of context, and this is where, I looked at my own memorization story. Of course, I started as one of those young musicians who memorized music as a foreign language, now coming to it later in my life, because for many years I didn't memorize music. Coming later, I now have all of that language in me, the theory and the form and the harmony, all these things. So I look at that differently. But I think that's a very good comparison. And obviously the most well-rounded memorization would be one that would take all of the syntax and theory, all these things into context to make the well-rounded memory. It's when I first was asked to memorize, I was a young pianist, and the teacher said, okay, memorize this piece for the recital. And so I went home and I memorized I don't even know how I did this. I just probably just repeated. And also I wasn't such a good reader then, I'm sure, because now I can look at a piece and I don't think about reading music. But then, so maybe the process of learning the piece, there was a lot more repetition than I would do today. That is a problem today, because I don't repeat things. I can read most music without a lot of difficulty. Mm-hmm. But back then, it was a foreign language, and maybe just repetition. And of course, I didn't understand what the language was. I just repeated what I kept repeating for myself.
Yes, and of course, it sounded well to your ears, and somehow probably you used this muscle memory, right? Worked, and somehow piece got into your fingers. But how about the performance? Did you have any memory slips or things like got out of control? Do you remember this time?
Well, when I was very young, I don't have any memory of how things went. I know things didn't go badly. I must have just played them. But I also, if I think back to when I was 10 years old, 7 years old, I probably wasn't very nervous. And the nervousness came later in life. So I did these things in as much as I don't remember how I memorized back then. I probably wasn't thinking a whole lot. And I probably wasn't very critical of if something went well or not. Those critical concerns came probably with adolescence, as they do for any teenager. Everyone becomes self-conscious. So once I became self-aware, It wasn't till a little bit later, maybe when I was 17, 18, also where the concerns about perfection came in. But that's also the stage where I really started to experience having colleagues and competition and really concerning myself with what other people thought. Because for me, my own musical life became more important and a bit more obsessive. Up until then, no. And it was about that time that I started studying at the college level, and that's when I encountered a teacher who became instrumental in my memorization practice and how to memorize. I had never thought of it before, even memorizing lots of pieces. I never really had a process, and I couldn't. If you ask me today, I can only say I probably just repeated and. But it was when I got to this next level that I, with that teacher, developed a process of memorization, and that is replicated to a great extent in this book. In many ways, it's his book. Michael Rui is my teacher in Chicago. Mm-hmm. The book is really not everything, but most of everything he taught me. So then years later, when I was in my late 30s, starting to memorize again, I came back to all of those things he taught me, and at the same time realized that there wasn't really anything out there in print that would have helped me do this. And that's when I had the idea to write a book about it. But so I'm a little off your question.
Well, you're not off the question, but you're deep into the question now, because you're completely right, because there weren't any books about this subject, right? And even about practicing music for keyboard instruments was not very, very well known, this subject, at least for casual performer or organist or harpsichordist or pianist. And I also remember how I memorized first music. My teacher also, when I was young, asked me to memorize, and I was really in pain, trying to memorize pages and pages, playing from top to bottom this page and repeating 100 times, and of course it didn't work, but somehow miraculously through lots of hours of repetition I did, right? And today when we look back, it's such a probably too complex process, right? Today we would do this much more systematically and strategically, thinking about these theoretical things, and maybe even use a different system that we know now there is. But earlier in the day, it was very, very complicated because nobody really told me anything about memorization. So I'm glad that I met you, and you will tell us how to do this correctly.
I don't know if I'll tell you exactly. And the book is pretty, it's fairly thorough. I tried, but to clarify, there are a few books out there, but most of what I found were short articles on the internet with tips and so on, and they aren't terribly complete. So you said the key word, which is systematic, and I think that and to come back to our childhood experiences is all those things I memorized as a child. I don't remember any of these now because they were they were in my fingers, but not in my ear, not in my brain. Now things I memorized today. 4 years ago, I can sit down and recall a whole lot of it because so many other parts of my come into play. So many other parts of my training make up that whole memorization picture. But the key word is systematic, and the other key word is patience. Once one develops a system for memorization, it's important to keep to that system because, as you know, once you start memorizing quickly, then it becomes a very surface memorization. It's not something that is deep, and you need depth when you are on stage and something unnerves you and you doubt yourself, which you never should do, but it happens. You need that depth to pull from to find yourself in that piece and find your way out of it, so that you simply don't stop or panic or any of these things. The truth is, a lot of this is about fear, and And as we started, it's maybe unnecessary fear, but it is finding strategies to work with the environment. In as much as we have to think about the acoustics of the room, we also have to think about maybe the anxiety of the room, and finding ways to really center ourselves and be able to work with all of our tools to perform from memory.
Paul, it's a little off topic of memorization, but when you mentioned anxiety, and it connects with memorization as well, I try to think of performance, musical performance, as a way of conversation, because this idea of musical language and these musical pieces being created as, for example, musical sermons, right? Biblical stories from Baroque period, let's say, on the harpsichord. I'm sure you play, like Johann Kuhnau biblical sonatas, right? And these were like really musical sermons for the day. And if we think about performance as a way of communication with the listeners, with congregation, with the audience of some sort, then our anxiety is not a big deal. We are trying to project some story, right? Communicate something and not think about ourselves, right?
Well, and I address this in the book because the thing is, nobody buys tickets to a concert or even attends a free concert wanting to hear the performer make a mistake. And nobody expects the performer to make a mistake. When we go hear any concert or a theater piece, we expect it to be what it is. But this is the other element of that is tied to ego, and it comes back to this idea of anxiety, and back to the recording industry. We want things to be perfect. And I think ultimately, as performers, we need to think of that conversation, because we have to remove our egos from the performance and make it a dialogue with the audience. And there are many other ways to think of this, but ultimately, I think a lot of the fear is tied into ego. We want to be perfect. We want it to be the best performance ever. And that, of course, comes from conservatory. It comes from competition. It comes from the entire market of being a musician in today's environment. But ultimately, it leads to, it comes from, I think it comes from ego. One of the techniques I talk about in the book, which was very helpful when I came back to memory in my late 30s, and is still helpful today, is the use of meditation practice.
Exactly.
And I started it as a way to calm myself and to focus. But as I learned from real Buddhist style meditation, that I started it to I got into meditation as a way to be in the moment. I'm trying to think of the exact words that practitioners use, but to
be present, yeah.
Present. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yes.
Right. So that was my original reason. But as I meditated more and more and became a little more interested in the whole Buddhist practice, I realized that part of being present was also removing the ego. And in doing so, I began to feel the audience as I played, but in a good way, not in a way that they're staring at me, they're looking at me, they're making me nervous. Instead, I was feeling the audience as humans who are part of this conversation. And by removing the ego, I removed a lot of my nerves, because I was no longer worried about making a mistake. I was more concerned with this dialogue with the audience. And granted, a performance is sometimes a one-sided dialogue. I'm doing all the playing, but there is that level of communication. And removing the ego made it so much more possible. It's a very hard state to achieve, because there are many performances still that I go and I'm more concerned about being correct than about that dialogue, and it's an important lesson. But I will never be a Buddhist monk, and I will never be transcendent in my meditation practice. But in meditation, though, one can get closer and closer to the core of the egoless self, and that becomes part of the transcendent performance. But it is a long road. I mean, think of great meditators, and these aren't just Buddhists. Think of the religious orders in the Catholic Church. These people achieve the state of selflessness, and it's through constant prayer and meditation. So if I can just get a tiny bit of that into my performance, it's a great thing. But it is a hard road. But sometimes when you're working on something as difficult as memorization, it's not a bad idea to distract yourself with a little meditation to put your importance on that practice so that the memorization doesn't become such an obsession.
Exactly. Paul, you mentioned meditation, focus. Do you think that breathing also plays a big part here too?
I think that especially for keyboardists, breathing is always important. I have made, before going into meditation and memorization, breathing was a very important part of my harpsichord playing. If anyone listens to the great Gustav Leonhardt, just as a start, I mean, there's a player who breathes. So that is important. Obviously, in meditation practice, breathing is important. And in the context of which I was speaking, breathing is important in calming oneself, and I still feel that before I perform, especially from memory, I do meditate before the performance, and simply that is helpful in calming and getting into a good state of mind.
Do you think, Paul, about the performance as meditation itself sometimes? The state of bliss and calmness and presence that you can even be so calm during play, during performance. I think it's a little connected, right? Yes, we try to calm ourselves before the performance. But this meditation practice can be transferred into the playing itself. Sometimes.
I have to say that some of my best performances are the ones where I hate being backstage. I absolutely hate it. This waiting period. So often, if I'm stuck back there, what do? I meditate, and I can't say I love meditating. It's hard work. But if I'm stuck backstage for 25 minutes or 30 minutes before I go out and I'm meditating, when I go on stage, I am in a very calm state and very focused. And I can make it through, if we're talking about a real concert program with 40 minutes and then 35 minutes, I can make it through that first half of the program in a very good state. And then at intermission, I'll meditate. It's rare when I have that time to do that, and it's actually been most successful if I've had a concerto appearance, because a concerto is 15 minutes, 12 minutes, depends on the composer and the piece. But so that's, I've been very happy with those performances. But I'll tell you one story. A few years ago, I was playing a Rameau suite, and I think it was the E major suite, and it's a wonderful, joyful piece. I came out to play this, and I had meditated. And I played I played it like I always play it, and I think it's I take the character of the piece. But afterwards, someone came up to me and said, "You look so serious," and that was such happy music. And I thought, "Oh dear." The problem is, and this is true in the United States, but I know it's true in most places, that audiences come to expect their performers to be smiling and oozing over the keyboard and throwing their arms and looking happy and winking at the audience and being cute. And here I was, like a monk, coming out and playing this piece, and I wasn't being serious. I was being focused, but unfortunately that audience member thought I was too serious. It doesn't matter what the audience sees. I wish they would close their eyes and listen. But, that was my one negative experience of coming out in a meditative state, because I guess they expected me to smile, but that's their problem, not mine.
Well, yes, they sometimes expect a show, right? A show. You put on a show, like sometimes great show organists would, change their clothes in the middle of intermission, put very, very showy music, and that's sometimes a tradition. Yes, not only in America but in Europe too. But I guess what you mentioned about meditation and calming is very, very important, and sometimes it looks that way to our audiences, that we are being too serious or working very hard, but let them do this, all right? We can't control their feelings, right? So
right. I should say one thing. Now I've lost my thought. I was going to say one thing I talk about in my book. Oh yeah, with regard to this meditation, is I caution, especially for someone who is new to memorization, you have to be very cautious about talking to your audience. When I played with music, I have no problem talking to my audience. It's still a problem because you talk and then you play, and it's hard to find the focus. Mm-hmm. But I have found playing a memorized recital, and then, which has become very common, people expect more and more that you talk to the audience and interact with them. That level of communication, I find that very hard to do, to have a conversation and then play from memory. When I come out on stage and I'm focused and then I'm expected to talk, it's crazy. And it's, there are people who do that very well, and those are people who've probably been playing from memory much longer than I have. But I do find when I'm forced into that type of situation, I have to be extremely careful and to be very well prepared with what I will say, unlike right now where I'm completely unprepared with what I will say. And to be very careful not to lose my focus.
Mm-hmm. Focus is the key word here, right? Because audience doesn't know what you have to do this, how to do this properly. They are here either to be entertained, right, or to spend a good time, or listen to the beautiful music and listen to the beautiful stories you are telling. But you are here to work, right, and to work.
I guess so.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges, you just said it, they're there to be entertained. Let's face it, a large part of our audiences, it is entertainment. And I think for musicians, especially those who memorize and those who meditate, our music becomes a very spiritual experience. I talk a little in the book about learning to love your audience a little, because they don't understand the process. And between the audience that wants to be entertained and then your colleagues who are there, who might not be in your best interest and might not want the best thing for you, maybe want to hear a mistake, or they're there critically. It's a difficult thing, and I come back to removing the ego as much as possible, because we cannot anticipate what people want, and all we can do is present ourselves as well as we can. It's not so healthy to worry about the audience.
You mentioned how you don't like being backstage. I also hate being backstage, and hate being backstage so much that before my last recital in Vilnius, just a week ago basically, I actually descended down the stairs from the balcony, organ balcony, before the concert, and started talking to the people, to the gathering audience before my playing, greeting them basically. And
right.
That actually helped me lose some anxiety also, because we've been chatting like friends, although they were strangers sometimes, but we were chatting and making a conversation happen, and that helped me sort of relax a little bit. And then I went back when the bell rang and upstairs, and then I improvised. I didn't play from memory, but I improvised. It's a different thing, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's for a memorizer or anyone really, it's usually helpful for a recital program that the first piece on the program be a little bit something that's not long, and something that can help you regain that focus because we do have these distractions. In the book, I talk about backstage people, the people working in the theater. They don't care about the recital, and they're just having fun, and they joke and all this, and you're trying to be focused. So to have a short piece where you can regain your focus is helpful. But I have a story about my first big recital when I was a student. I remember waiting backstage, and I was able to see the audience. And of course, I was a student, so these were mostly friends and family. And I had this vision that I was at my own funeral.
Great.
And that these people had come to see my funeral. That's how it felt. So that was a strange moment. But we do have to develop good backstage techniques and rituals, I think, to make things work, because we are working, and we're working hard, and we have to be conscious of doing that well, even especially if you don't like being backstage, not to be distracted by that. As I say in the book, don't start looking at your phone and playing games and all these things, because you're there to work.
Yes, and you mentioned the special feeling, right, before, when you look at the audience. I've read someplace that an improviser from theater experience, from theater background, sometimes when she is nervous, she looks at the audience and imagines the audience to be naked.
Oh, I do that most days. I imagine everyone naked. That's a whole nother thing.
But then, yes, you relax, right? How can you be nervous if they are naked? They should be nervous, right? So wonderful.
I once told that to my students. I had students in the classroom in a music history class, and they were supposed to give papers on a presentation. They were nervous. Some of them were nervous. I said, just imagine we're all naked. Well, they had never heard that before, and I was afraid they were going to call my superior for
right.
Sexual harassment, and oh boy.
Yeah. But sometimes students are, very understandable, and even though it's not something they are experienced to, but they are still human, right? And they understand you.
But some of my students are human. I don't know about all of them.
Great. Well, Paul, let's talk about memorization then, a little bit in detail. When I was studying in United States, I learned two techniques to memorize, and I'm sure you have tens of techniques, but probably you use a few of them that I'm familiar too. For example, do you advise to memorize part by part, voice by voice, and then completely voiced combinations, 2 voices, 3 voices?
When I was an undergraduate, my piano teacher had required that for Bach fugues, and to memorize individual voices. Now that I'm older and I understand what a Bach fugue is and how it works, I do not like this practice, because it seemed to work at the time because I had not developed my ear and all of these things as they are now, but I don't truly believe, because a fugue is not heard in that manner, even though it may be composed in that manner. I think it works, but it's a lot of time. That is, if you really want to take your time memorizing, do each voice separate. I think that's I think it's a little crazy. I think it works, but I don't think it's the most efficient method. And I don't know if it's the most musical method. In the case of Bach, we know that every voice in a fugue is accounted for. They're all well written. They all exist on their own. You can't use that technique on a Handel fugue where he drops a voice here and there. And so it's a bit special and unique to Bach, but I think it's a very long road to take that route. I think there are better ways to do it. But you did mention go on. You were going to mention another technique.
Yeah. I've heard this technique from George Ritchie, organist from Nebraska, but currently retired living in Portland, Oregon. And He heard this technique from the German blind organist Helmut Walcher.
Helmut Walcher,
Yeah,
right.
who taught him in Germany to play Bach, of course, polyphonic pieces, and because Walcher was blind, he also himself taught this way, the fugues and the chorales as well. Somebody dictated, the soprano part, maybe a couple of measures, then alto part, couple of measures, and the tenor part, and then the bass part. The same two measures, and then he combined them in his head and made it into four-part excerpt basically. And then another practice session came. Somebody of his students dictated to him another segment, right, of separate parts. But he was blind, so George Ritchie advised me to experiment at least with one fugue, at least. So I learned C major fugue. Organ fugue, not well-tempered clavier, BWV 547, very, very scholastic fugue. And yes, you mentioned very, very long process, not the most efficient one, but I'm glad I did it because I know how George Ritchie felt now, and I know how Helmut Walcher did too.
Well, to be fair, we are talking about Bach, and I would say I have personally, I'm sure there are some out there, but I've personally not encountered a composer who is more difficult to memorize. But we always go with the biggest example of Bach, but I think compared to memorizing other music, there are very few things that are more difficult. So if someone is coming to memory for the first time, I would not start with Bach. And early on in my late 30s, in my return to memorization, I started with Bach, and I had this naive plan to memorize well-tempered clavier, and I was well on my way, but quickly realized that if I really made myself do that so early in this new manner of memorization, I would lose my passion because it was such a headache. And it's wonderful, wonderful music, but first, I don't know if I would want to play an entire program of well-tempered clavier, so it wasn't entirely practical, but I set too difficult of a task for myself. I can say that memorizing a Bach prelude and fugue will take me maybe even 4 times as much time as memorizing something of the same length by a lesser or even just a different composer. Mm-hmm. So I think in academia, for its purposes, we all should learn Bach, and I think memorizing Bach the rewards are wonderful because of what it does for the ear and the technique and the conception, all these things. But it is not a great way to start because it's so difficult. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do is try to find out exactly what I mean.
Yes, Paul, I know. And you mentioned you were naive, right? But I was even more naive because I wanted to memorize all Bach organ works.
Right, and then there are these people that do, and I mentioned Messiaen at the beginning of this program, and thinking of memorizing Messiaen, I think of Paul Jacobs, who's teaching at Juilliard, and he's performed the complete Messiaen from memory, not using the same organ. So that's already way out of my league, and of course the complete Bach as well. So these are remarkable skills, and I would say that my book does not address that type of memory, and I don't want to discount Paul and say, oh, he's just a genius and that's why he does it. But I think someone who's able to do that is working with a very different brain. Let's say I have an average brain. I think Paul is something a little bit different there to be able to do that. So I don't know Paul's method, and I'm not entirely sure that his own personal method would be great for the average person. I would say that my method is pretty good for an average person. Mm-hmm. Who may not be planning on memorizing the entire Messiaen and the entire Bach and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Yes, of course. And another method that I've heard and often use, actually, even today, is to memorize in shorter fragments. But, let's say 4-measure fragment, right? And then actually memorize one measure at a time and then 2 measures at a time of that fragment, and then 3 measures, and then complete 4-measure fragment. I've read it from Marcel Dupré, 79 organ chorale preludes. He advises that, or advised when he was alive. What do you think about that?
Well, in my book, I outline a very clear foundation for memorization practice, and one of the techniques I discuss is what I call landmarks, and landmarks are large phrase markings, or even small phrase markings, and they function like rehearsal letters in an orchestra score, where you have letter A, letter B, and so on. And those are landmarks in their own way, and most composers don't create them. Those are made by editors. So in the memorization process, whereas at the very early stage one might have to memorize in a set of measures, I tend to encourage that one memorizes a phrase, and that could be 8 bars. It could be eventually an entire page or a page and a half, depending on what the music is doing. When the landmarks are something that each musician must create for him or herself, and the purpose of there are 2 purposes of making a landmark. One is the sheer practice of memorizing a section, however many measures. But the other purpose of making a landmark, and again, you make these yourselves where you're comfortable at these points, is you need a place of recovery. So if you are playing a section of a piece and you have a memory lapse, because it's going to happen, we all make mistakes, if you have a problem, you need a place where you can go back or forward to for your recovery. The audience does not want to hear you repeat the same measure 20 times. So what you have to do, if you get stuck in the middle of your landmark, maybe improvise a little, and maybe you get out, but maybe you don't, and you have to jump to the next landmark or backwards to where you were before. And you can do that with some improvisation. So for me, the landmark has that double purpose, part of the learning, but also part of the recovery. Also down the road, when you are working your music away from the instrument, a very important technique, when you're working when you're visualizing your music, when you're thinking about it, I like to work in those landmarks too, because it's simply not enough to sit down away from the instrument and think through the entire piece from the beginning to the end. It's important to think about those landmarks. So I tend to work, when I work mentally away from the instrument, I work backwards. I'll work, letter L to M, and then I'll do what comes before L, A, B, C, a K to L, and then, and working in reverse order, C to D, and then B to C, and then A to B, so that I always retain those landmarks, because in some ways, knowing your landmarks is more important than knowing the notes, because the landmarks are the pillars that are going to help create the entire illusion of the piece.
What an excellent idea to really to segmentize the piece into these, as you say, landmarks, and you can even learn them in accidental order, right?
Yes.
Actually, random order, right? And even it's great if you know letter M, and then if you can jump to letter D, for example, very random order, right?
Right.
It's really deep knowledge of the piece if you can do that, because always we tend to, even when we memorize and perform, we play from the beginning until the end, right? And that's not something very deep.
One thing I comment on in the book is the difference between playing a solo recital versus a concerto. In a concerto, you do play beginning to end because the orchestra keeps playing. So if you have a memory lapse in a concerto and you're playing, the orchestra keeps going, you can catch up to them. But in a solo recital, if you're playing a piece, you can go backwards. So in a solo piece, it's very easy to get stuck in a loop. If you can't find your ending, that is a problem. At least in the concerto, you're always moving forward. But you are right to understand everything. And about landmarks, when you're first learning a piece, let's say you have a 4-part fugue. Your soprano, let's say it starts soprano and then alto, tenor, bass. Your first soprano fugue subject you might call that a landmark. And then when the alto comes in, you'll learn soprano alto as another landmark, and then tenor, and so on. But by the time you really know the piece, you may consider that entire exposition of soprano, alto, tenor, bass up until the first real episode, you might call that one big landmark. Because the truth is, by the time you've got those four parts together, you're pretty solid. You're not going to drop that in a performance. So your landmarks don't have to be micromanaged on a very small scale. I think as a piece gets learned, the landmarks get bigger and bigger as you conceptualize the piece.
Right. Do you, Paul, advise to transpose the piece also in practice purposes?
I have never done that as part of my memorization practice, but I can tell you that when I know a piece very well, the act of transposition, I would say, would not be terribly difficult. Of course, that's easy to say because I don't do it, but I think it's a good technique. There's so many, in many ways, memorization is a process of keeping ourselves entertained with the process. Mm-hmm. So if one wanted to check transposition as much as jumping around landmarks, these are all techniques that can be useful to the process. I would just be careful that the process doesn't become the goal, and that the goal is in itself memorization. Do we really need to transpose a piece? Probably not, but it can be helpful as part of, and that is a technique that might be more valuable doing away from the instrument in your mind. Mm-hmm. Because why do we really need to know new fingerings for a piece, which is going to happen with a transposition? May not be the most useful. A little bit like memorizing separate voices. It can help. But above all, with all of these techniques, including landmarks, I advise keeping a notebook, a practice log, as I call it, so that you mentioned Helmut Walche and the process of learning a few measures, and then in the next session, a few more measures. Well, if you don't write this down, you're not necessarily going to remember what you did the last time. Mm-hmm. I am compulsive about this. I enjoy practicing, but I don't always want to practice. So I use a practice log and a timer so that I know exactly what I intend to do. And this is good for any practicing, even if you don't memorize, is let's say I have an hour to practice. It's a busy day. I can only devote this much time. Before I begin, I take out my log. I write down how much time I have, how much I'm going to do, and what I'm going to do. I look at yesterday's practice session, what I planned on doing that day, and I mark it out in terms of time. It's so easy to get absorbed in the totality of a piece of music. So if you say, I'll do this for 10 minutes, and this for 5 minutes, and all of this, and breaking up the practice session in a very organized manner, I find that the result is a real efficiency that you'd be surprised at how much quicker things come, because it's easy to get obsessed with this cycle of doing the same thing over and over again. And if you break it into manageable sections, the time goes faster, it's more organized, and then you actually have a written record of what you did.
Yes, and it's like a diary, right? Your practice diary. It helps you remember things of what you did 1 month ago, right? 1 year ago, even.
Right, and I used my practice log years later to come back to see how did I practice this piece, because I use my notes, and if I'm doing a big piece like a concerto movement, I will organize my landmarks thematically and all this, and I use that in the diary so I can come back to something from years before. Very, very useful. Also, it's useful with a distracted mind, which is a big part of practicing as you're thinking of other things. If something enters your mind, you can write it down, and you don't have to stop your practice session. Like, oh, I forgot to feed the cat. So you write that down. Of course, the cat would tell you too. But you can write that down and then take care of it when you take a break from practicing. Yeah. And I should mention, I include my breaks in the log too with a timer. So I say I'm going to do 20 minutes and then a 5-minute break. Because if I just say I'll do 20 minutes and then take a break, that break will become 2 hours before I know it. And because then I'm looking at Facebook, or I don't do Facebook anymore because it's such a distraction. But, to time your time away, otherwise your day is gone. And if you have a limited time, which is sometimes easier because you when you have a closed window, you don't have the entire world in front of you. It's a little bit easier. So to be very specific with timing and what you intend to do, and then your goals, like what are your landmarks going to be, or and we have to remember too, when we're learning music, we're learning a number of pieces, and they're all at different stages. So the practice log will help you quantify what you are doing with all of these pieces. You might, in your practice session, you might want to simply play through a piece once, a piece that you learned a week ago. Put that in, and how long will it take, and then you're done with it. But to be deliberate in your actions.
Yeah, systematic too. Great. And Paul, what about memorizing away from the instrument, on the table, for example, just looking at the music?
Yeah, this is, I would say, as important of a technique as memorizing at the instrument. Mm-hmm. And I start I call it mental work, but that's simple, oversimplifying, but I'll use that term since I use it in the book. I start my mental work at the beginning. So what I will do, let's say a brand new piece, and I've never heard it before, which is the hardest way to go. I do not recommend listening to recordings to learn a piece, but the fact is that if you have a piece like that you've heard, many, many times by other performers, it's easier to memorize because it's in your ear. But let's say you have a brand new piece, or even a piece you've heard. It's Monday morning, the first thing you're doing, so I get the practice log. The first thing I say is I'm not going to spend a day on this because I will go crazy, and you can't retain that much memory. So let's say I'm going to sit down first at the table, and I may not know where to put my landmark yet. So let's say I'll look at the first page of the piece, and I'm going to do this for 5 minutes. And then I will try it at the instrument for maybe 8 minutes. And remember, I use a timer for these things so I can be very precise. I would use more time at the instrument because mental work is very hard, and it takes a tremendous discipline, and it's not the funnest thing to do. So what I will do is I will set a metronome marking all the way from the beginning, a very slow metronome, and I will sit at the table with that metronome and the timer. Fortunately, these things are all on smartphones now, so you don't need all these tools. And I will look at the score, and I will go through it up to that landmark, just that length that I had said I would do, and maybe look through it, try to close my eyes to work it without the score, if at all. Just get a vision of this. Then I will go to the instrument, usually a slightly faster metronome marking at the instrument with a timer, and do this. And as days go on, this process becomes faster. It becomes, certainly at the table, I try to work with my eyes closed to visualize the music. And then as I work at the instrument, then at this point I can start working these passages from memory. And eventually this becomes on a big scale. One thing I should say I use at the instrument, rather than have the music in front of me, I have a music stand next to the instrument so that I don't get in the habit of looking at the score, that I try to really work away from the score, and then I can look over my shoulder at the music. You can't do that at the very beginning, of course, but it is a technique I use. So I'm employing mental work throughout the entire process. And when it comes to the recital, I will actually spend more time away from the instrument than at the instrument, because I don't need to play this music so many times. I know how to play it. What I need to do is be able to visualize this away from the instrument, because when you're on stage, that's all you have. Of course, you have the tactile, the digital memory, and all those things too in your ear. But the one thing that is the most solid is going to be your memory, I feel. And so that it's also the hardest thing to work. So I tend to, my ratio is maybe 2 to 1 before a recital, 2 times as much away from the instrument as at the instrument. And by the time it's a recital, that's not a bad thing, because maybe you'd rather be sitting in the garden drinking a coffee and doing this, and I'll sit outside with a metronome and a timer in the summer, and I'll go through my music, then I go in the house and I play it, and then I go back outside. It's a nice process when it's learned. But the early stages, obviously, you're going between the instrument. It's good exercise, too. You're not sitting all the time.
Yeah, yeah, Paul, you're completely right. And I'm very conscious of your time now, and don't don't want to keep you too long in this conversation. But one of the closing questions I have is about analysis of the piece. Because it's probably connected with memorization too. The more you can analyze the piece theoretically and harmonically and structurally, the better probably your memorization process will be. So, how early in the practice do you advise to do this?
Well, because I'm talking about landmarks, you are already using some kind of aural analysis to just hear the phrase and so on. I don't do a hard analysis of most pieces. I think ultimately, I don't need to. As I'm learning the piece, it's obvious to me when the piece is moving to a different key and so on. I don't feel that. I think maybe a younger, less experienced player might need to do that. But I most certainly don't play a piece and think, oh, the harmony is now tonic, the harmony is now subdominant. I don't map out in a strict harmonic analysis. I think that's it can be helpful, but I think it's a bit of a waste of time. In spite of those years of music theory, I don't need to do it because we hear music on a arched, larger scale, I think, than this micromanagement. Now, if there's a passage that is a real problem, I will analyze the two measures and so on and just be really specific if I can't really hear it or something. But when I will say that when I work on a concerto, specifically Bach concertos, because Bach is squirrely. He never is very. He's never the same twice. It drives me nuts, but it's why the music is so beautiful. So in a concerto movement, I will be more analytical about how the ritornello. It's the issue with concertos of Bach is how the ritornello enters and exits. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes the ritornello is complete, other times it's partial, and other times you enter in the middle of a ritornello, and so on. So there and also because ritornelli in a concerto function as their own landmarks. So it's important to know if a ritornello is in the tonic or the dominant or subdominant. Those things are important. But I will say that the process of memorization has made my analytical skills much better, in as much as it's made my ear so much better. I can hear better at the instrument. I can improvise better. All of this is better. There's a good reason why old school teachers forced all their students to memorize. It's less common now, but back then, there's a great reason. It is the best teacher. It's better than a classroom to memorize your music because all of these things that you may have learned come into play. So it forces you to do all the good things you learned before.
And there is good reason why Czerny and Beethoven played every morning complete well-tempered clavier by memory too.
Yes, but I'm no Czerny or Beethoven. But someday.
But you see the connection here.
Yes.
Because of course they were creators, the composers and improvisers, and they learned from the masters, of course, who came before them, and they tried to keep this musical model ahead of them, in front of them actually, and keep in their brain as well. So that connects to your story too. So, Paul, I'm so grateful to you that you shared this information today with us so generously and inspired hundreds of people around the world today. And can you tell our listeners how they can find you and your book online?
Yes, we should do that. The book is available from Amazon, and of course they can go to any bookstore to request the book if it's not in stock. But through Amazon, you can buy a print version. I also have it available on Kindle, and I believe it's available for other electronic readers. The book is called By Heart: The Art of Memorizing Music. And nobody will ever spell my name correctly. So if I say Paul Cienniwa, you're going to have a hard time getting that. But if you look up By Heart, The Art of Memorizing Music, you could also go to Amazon or even a Google search, I'm sure, and just look up Memorizing Music. And I imagine the book will appear. It's short. It's in about 100 pages or so, a little less, and not terribly expensive. And I intended it to be something of a handbook for people and a good guideline. And the book is doing well. So there's certainly a need for this type of book out there. And I got a little lucky in writing a book that not a lot of people have written about. And it's generated some nice interest. So there you go.
Your website is. Can you spell your website too?
Oh, well, it's my last name, so obviously I'm hard to find. It is Paul, Paul, and my last name Cienniwa, so Paul CIENNIWA.com.
Great. People will find you, and I'll make sure I will include these descriptions, these links into the description of this podcast too.
Thank you.
So thanks so much, Paul, for this conversation, and keep up the good work and your research and your performance and your creativity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad we finally got the technology to work, and have a wonderful new year.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great 2016. If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog, Secrets of Organ Playing, at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice, and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pinkevicius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.